chaos magical approach, it would be more focused on that, on what you said. So the idea that, this is my intent, this is what I want to get. So I will call upon this specific deity or this specific archetype to obtain what is that I want. In Roman times, and even with the Hellenization of the Roman gods and goddesses, you have that every place has their specific entity. You find the same thing even now with Christian, I wouldn't say deities because they would be inaccurate from a Christian perspective, but for instance with the Holy Mary and the Madonna, you would find that in Italy you have the different Madonnas for specific places, and they will have different characteristics depending on the place. So you may have a Madonna of a specific city, a Madonna of another specific city, and they have different characteristics and things that they can bring about in your life. So you could argue that it is a form of, folk magic practice in that sense. But with Diana, you have that one of the attributes of Diana, even in Latin, is Diana Lucifera, which is Diana Luciferian, you could say, so bringer of light. So that is why there has been this association between Diana and Lucifer as these two entities connected to light. Perhaps the light in the night, the moon, and the light in the day, the sun.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I'm with Dr. Angela Puca, returning for the second time. This was like 4 or 5 months ago. You were on my channel, and it was a really good episode. People really liked it, and I'm glad to have you back on. Ph.D. in religious studies, and your channel, Angela's Symposium, is a treasure of knowledge on religion, spirituality, the occult, all of the fun lore about magic and witchcraft and Wicca and all that stuff. It's all there. It is so underrated. Everybody who's watching this, pause the video, go and subscribe. The link's in the description. If you can't find it, it's right down there. Go and subscribe. I'm telling you, if you like my channel, you'll like this channel a lot more. It's a lot more scholarly and better, and I think that you're underrated, and I'm glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk about paganism and Italian folk magic. Before we get into Italian folk magic, paganism, it seems like you ask 10 different people what paganism is, you get 10 different answers. People don't really understand what it exactly is. Some people think it's the zodiac, or it's Greek mythology, or it's Vedic, or whatever. As a scholar in religious studies, what exactly is paganism?
Yeah, usually they say if you ask 10 pagans what paganism is, you will get 11 answers. But my experience is that it's more 20. But that's fine. I think it's the role of us scholars to sort of identify the patterns of meaning that people create, when they talk about their beliefs and their practices. So that's why, everybody has a role to play, including scholars. So paganism is an umbrella term that is used to encompass a set of earth-based, nature-worshipping religious practices and religious beliefs. Some may call them spiritualities, but as a religious studies scholar, I would argue that these are religious practices. Although I guess the matter of what constitutes a religion is a hot topic among scholars nowadays. And but yeah, I guess that's a bit of a different topic. But quite often I would say that practitioners or even pagans, maybe not necessarily pagans, because there are pagans that would define their practice as religion, but you find that a lot of magic practitioners often have kind of an aversion towards the term religion, and they prefer the term spirituality. And that is because the term religion is often associated with the three main monotheistic religions, but that is not necessarily what religion has to mean. And religion is still sort of a social actor that has a wider impact than the term spirituality, which is more of a loose label. Whereas when it comes to religion, you can have a dialogue with, with the political bodies and with society and with other people. So engaging with the term religion in a way that also redefines it, not as necessarily being linked to the three monotheisms, could be perhaps helpful, for both parties, because it allows to better understand what the practice is, and also to enter a dialogue that otherwise would be excluded from, because religion is something that is studied, it is something that is part of politics, that is part of our culture and society, and so it's kind of a main actor. But back to paganism, I'm sorry, I'm digressing. Back to paganism, as I said, it is an umbrella term, is often defined as an umbrella term to classify earth-based and nature-worshipping religions, which means that one of the core practice and one of the core belief is the idea of nature as something sacred. Now, I have heard of discourses within the practicing community of people arguing whether, pagans are trying to return to nature in a way that is, in a way, dichotomous to engaging with technology and with the contemporary world. And I would say that having researched pagans, I wouldn't say that that is the case at all. I mean, the idea of nature worshipping or even earth-based doesn't mean that pagans want to return to a different state of living. It has more to do with how they connect to nature, and how they view nature. So one of the aspects that you find in paganism is an immanent view of the divine. So usually you have that either the divine is seen as transcendent, which means that stays outside of the natural world, of the manifested world, and that is transcendence. And you find that in the monotheisms, for instance. Or you can have an immanent view of the divine, which means that the earth, everything that is material is imbued with the divine. So it's not the case that God or the goddess or the divine is outside of the material world. It is actually that it is imbued in everything. So there is nothing that is not divine. And this leads to something that has been called by scholars lately, the re-enchantment of the word. This is not only the case for paganism, but also for magic practitioners. So you have the idea that, so the idea of the disenchantment of the word comes from Max Weber. He wrote in an essay called Science as Vocation, if I remember correctly, that the modernity is defined by a disenchanted understanding of the world, which means that, the world that surrounds us is not, it's not full of magic and meaningful connections or hidden connections between things. Things are inanimate. So you have the human beings that have a consciousness that interact with inanimate objects. Whereas with paganism, and I would say also with other magic practicing traditions, you have a re-enchantment of the word. So it means that you are going back, or perhaps going forward, because it's never really going back, is it? But you get back that sense that things around us are sentient, they are living, and you can interact with them in a meaningful way just as you would be able to interact with other human beings in a meaningful way. Of course, you know, the kind of language and the kind of dialogue that you can establish with a partner, as opposed to a friend, as opposed to, you know, your pet or a tree, will be different, because it depends on the you know, on the person or the entity that you are interacting with. But there is still the belief that you can have this sort of dynamic, the sort of dialogue, interaction, connection with everything that surrounds us, because everything is living and sentient and is in a way enchanted, meaning that it has life. So this is one of the things that you find in paganism, but I'd say that this is also found in a lot of magic practicing traditions. Then you have a non-monotheistic approach to the divine, which means that in paganism you don't have that there is only one god. There are multiple gods. There are goddesses and gods and different pantheons, and people also mix and match different pantheons, and maybe they could worship as a god, you know, a god from a specific pantheon, from a specific culture, and as a goddess, a goddess from another pantheon again. Also, you have that paganism is not a revealed religion. It's not based on text, it's not based on sacred text, it's based on experience. So one thing that I find interesting is that there are people that are not within paganism. Perhaps they come from a more monotheistic approach to interacting with deities and the divine. And they ask, you know, for instance, how come pagans tend to sort of worship certain deities that perhaps if you go and read the myth about that specific deity, either you find things that are contradictory, or you find even things that could be seen as dangerous and threatening about a specific deity. But the thing about pagans is that even if, of course, there are some pagans that consider the mythology and the history around a certain god or a goddess, a certain deity, as more important than others. That also depends, and we can talk about that later. But even though there are pagans that value, you know, mythology and ancient texts around a certain deity, what counts the most for pagans usually is the experience that you have, the relationship that you establish. So if you have a deity that could be terrifying and loving and a lot of other things, if you read the mythology, what that deity represents to you depends on the relationship that you establish. And in that sense, it can be seen as similar to other interactions that we have in life. So, you know, I could be the evil character in the story of somebody and the savior in the story of somebody else.
Right.
So,
That's a good point.
so I think in this sense, and that is because that is connected also to how pagans perceive you know, deities, which is very different from monotheistic religions. So in monotheistic religions, you have a god creator that has created the world, and we already said that it is a transcendented god. Whereas here we have an immanent deity, an immanent divine. But apart from that, gods are considered by the hard polytheists as entities that inhabit a different realm of reality, but they are not the creators of the world, because often in paganism you find the idea that there is an ongoing creation. So you don't have one moment in time where the world has been created, then it just goes, you know, you have the creation, it's done.
Right.
Whereas you have more of the sense that the creation is an ongoing process, of which the gods and the goddesses take part in, but human beings also take part in that ongoing creation, and all the other things that are part of the manifested world as well. Yeah, that's fascinating, because in this sense, deities are entities that populate a different realm of reality, but they are not creators. And so, as a consequence, you have that a pagan being, a human being inhabiting this specific realm of reality, they can establish a connection with a specific deity and interact with them. Then when you establish a relationship, that is the meaning, and how you see that deity is primarily shaped by the relationship that you establish. You can have a guidance from the mythology and the history, but then what counts the most, usually for pagans, is the relationship that they establish, the experience. It's what counts the most. And then, as I mentioned the difference between, I mentioned hard polytheism, so I should also distinguish between hard polytheists and soft polytheists. So the hard polytheists are those that believe that gods and goddesses and deities actually exist. So they have ontological existence, we would say in philosophy. They actually exist in a realm of reality, or even in this realm of reality, they concretely exist. And the soft polytheists believe that deities are actually archetypes. So you have a sort of psychologizing approach, a Jungian approach here. You have the idea that, for instance, Eros could be the archetype of passionate love. Or you have that Aphrodite can be the archetype of love. I'm getting a lot of examples, love related.
Yeah.
Or you can have that Mars is the archetype of war. So it is more about seeing the existence of deities as symbolic, as symbolic. Not that, and of course, for the soft polytheists, it doesn't mean that that archetype or that symbol is any less influential in their working or in their worship or in their working with the deity. It's just the way they frame it, the belief that underlies their practice is quite different.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, and one thing I noticed you brought up a couple of times is that the focus is not necessarily on the text or the scriptures, but more on the ritual, the experience, and I think an example. I mean, what do you think about the example of like Illusionarian mysteries, where they they have these rites where you get initiated, and is this sort of what pagans are more focused on rather than scripture and dogmatism or following certain laws, stuff like that?
Well, certainly they are not focused on scriptures, because as I said, it's not a revealed religion. So they are not really, they don't seek or follow prophets. They don't seek or follow specific texts. It's more about the experience. It's more about perhaps even traditional practices that they may follow, and initiatory practices, or their own personal individual path. So it is, I would say, it's more experience focused rather than theory oriented in a way. And you can still see certain patterns in terms of the ideas and the beliefs that you find in paganism, but yeah, definitely not not based on scriptures.
Do you think that with there being multiple deities, and like you said, sometimes it's like they're literally that's the god, or sometimes it's softer where it's like more Jungian, like archetypal, like you said, but in both cases, do you think that the individual could sort of approach different gods? For example, a person gets in a boat and he's at sea, he's traveling at sea, they might give an offering to Poseidon in that specific time, or somebody might be at a party and in that particular time they give an offering or a prayer to Dionysus because they want to have a good time. Do you think that's sort of a way that it's done, or is that something else?
Do you mean in terms of connecting with the deity for a specific purpose?
Yes, exactly. Having specific things, and they're connected to a specific deity because they're trying to connect to that certain aspect of whatever they're doing.
that there are some practitioners that do that, but I wouldn't say that it is exhaustive in defining how pagans interact with the deities. It depends. In some cases, you would find that some pagans feel they are called by a specific deity, like I don't know, Hecate or um, any other deity. I think that Hecate and Lilith are quite popular at the moment, and even Lucifer is seems to be quite particularly popular among practitioners. I'd say that it depends. Maybe for a chaos magical approach, it would be more focused on that, on what you said. So the idea that this is my intent, this is what I want to get, so I will call upon this specific deity or this specific archetype to obtain what is that I want. But there are other practitioners and other pagans that would focus more on maybe a longer, in terms of the extent of time they work with a specific deity. They try to establish a long-term relationship or even a short-term relationship, but it is more about connecting with that deity, not necessarily for magical purposes or for one specific purpose that you have to begin with, but perhaps because you feel attracted to that deity, or because you feel called by that deity, because you have dreams about that deity. So there are a few reasons as to why pagans usually connect with one deity as opposed to another. But I would say that at least for pagans, for those for whom the magic is not, the primary focus, they tend to get close to certain deities and establish relationship with deities based on, you know, uh, how they feel, whether they feel drawn to that specific pantheon or to that specific deity, or whether they feel like they have been called by that specific deity to establish a relationship and have a different experience in life due to that specific connection.
You mentioned Lucifer, and you hear so many different things about Lucifer. So, for example, Hesiod has a version of Lucifer who is the morning star. He's like the male version of Venus. But then in Christianity, all of a sudden he becomes an equal to Satan. Basically, he is Satan. Basically, what is the real, true? Who is Lucifer, and why is he so misunderstood by people?
I wouldn't say that there is one true depiction of Lucifer. It really depends on the context. It's difficult, especially with a deity, or with an entity. It's difficult to say what is the true depiction, because these are all depictions that come from practitioners, religious practitioners, and so as a consequence, it depends on the context. I think that, of course, the way Lucifer is depicted in Christianity is quite different from the way it is depicted among magic practitioners that are not Christians or that are pagans. And you have different depictions of Lucifer. So now there is more of a positive outlook on Lucifer, seen as the light bringer and morning star, and it is perceived by practitioners with a positive connotation. There are some practitioners that think that Lucifer is the male aspect or the male counterpart of Diana, and and there have been also, you have in the Geoffrey Leland, the Gospel of Aradia, you have the concept that Lucifer is the brother and consort of Diana. And you have, in Italy, you have that there are certain statues and certain in Roman times, and even with the Hellenization of the Roman gods and goddesses, you have that every place has their specific entity. You find the same thing even now with Christian, I wouldn't say deities because they would be inaccurate from a Christian perspective, but for instance with the Holy Mary and the Madonna, you would find that in Italy you have the different Madonnas for specific places, and they will have different characteristics depending on the place. So you may have a Madonna of a specific city, a Madonna of another specific city, and they have different characteristics and things that they can bring about in your life. So you could argue that it is a form of, folk magic practice in that sense. But with Diana, you have that one of the attributes of Diana, even in Latin, is Diana Lucifera, which is Diana Luciferian, you could say, so bringer of light. So that is why there has been this association between Diana and Lucifer as these two entities connected to light. Perhaps the light in the night, the moon, and the light in the day, the sun. But yeah, these are all. I'm not sure about the historical accuracy of these claims, because.
Sure. But it's fascinating that you mentioned that, because it seems like these gods, and whatever the hierarchy may be, there seems like they all play a purpose of representing a phenomena in nature. So that the crescent moon, or the trees, how the trees grow, or the rainfall, or the sea. And there's a deity behind this, and it's basically representing the phenomena that we see. But yeah, do you think that's sort of what these deities are doing, or what their purpose is, I should say?
You have that in quite a few ancient pre-Christian religions. We could call them pagan religions, although that is also debated, because some people say that you cannot retroactively call paganism something that was not, didn't have that sort of unifying label. But yeah, the pre-Christian traditions that we could call, for simplicity, pagan traditions, like in the Roman times or the Greek times, you do have this perception of gods and goddesses associated with natural phenomena and aspects of nature. This was more the case for the Romans, especially before the Hellenization. In fact, now we have the idea that the Roman deities were anthropomorphized, what's the right term? Were made into resembling human beings. But that process only happened after the Hellenization of Rome and Roman culture, whereas in ancient times, for the Romans, deities like, for instance, Jupiter or Venus, they were just the natural phenomena. So Jupiter, for instance, would have been the thunder. Whereas after the Hellenization, since the Greek deities were more personified, were associated with human traits and human characteristics, then you start having that even in Rome, they began to personify their deities, and they were not just the natural phenomena, but they were also entities that resembled human beings. So why would this happen? I'd say that there is an underlying, in polytheistic religions, there is an underlying animism to different degrees, and pantheism perhaps to different degrees. So pantheism means that the divine is in everything, which is closely connected with the idea that we mentioned earlier about the divine being immanent, which means the divine is inside of the creation. Pantheism means that the divine is in everything, and animism means that everything has a soul, an anima or animus, to use Jungian terms. But even though for Jung that was a bit different, I don't want to confuse viewers. But yeah, animism is the idea that everything has a soul. So when you have deities that represent natural phenomena, you are doing a few things. So you are acknowledging that what is happening around you is divine, and you are enacting a process of reification. Reification is a term that means that you make something into a thing. So something that is abstract, you make it into a thing, something that sometimes label reify things, make something into a thing that before the label you wouldn't know how to describe that thing, and it was just up in the air, to abstract, to be talked about and to sort of have a conversation about. So there is a process of reification in a way. So you make something that is apparently abstract into a thing that you can interact with, that you can talk about, that enters the conversation, enters the dialogue that you can have. And if you see everything as divine, then as a consequence, and you have this process of reification where the thunder becomes a thing, becomes something that you can talk about, that you can worship, that you can interact, then it means that the existence of these deities, these entities, allows people to establish a connection and a relationship with the divinity, with the divine, with the gods and the goddesses that are within everything that lives, but they elude language, and they elude um, specific definitions, and so you need a way of making the interaction possible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I actually came across a poem by Catullus, a Roman poet from the 1st century BC, who wrote hymn to Diana, and it was like, "Hallowed be thy name," and it was like all these phrases that you hear in Christian prayers, but he was using the same sort of language for Diana, and I just thought that was really interesting. But I want to talk about the Italian folk magic, and what exactly is it, and where does it come from? Where is the origins of it? All that stuff.
Oh, yeah. Basically, I have studied for my PhD. My PhD was on the indigenous and transcultural shamanism in Italy, and it ended up including folk magic in Italy, which for my PhD, I systematized the different forms of Italian folk magic under the label of the tradition of segnature. And then I argued in my PhD dissertation that it can be deemed as the indigenous shamanism of Italy. But that is a big topic, because I would need to clarify what I mean by indigenous, how I problematize the term, and why I argue for a disentangling of the categories of indigenous religion and indigenous people. But I have a video on my channel about that if people are interested. And also, how can we define shamanism in a way that is more accurate and is not Western centric, and has a certain underlying exoticizing flavor to that. But yeah, we are not talking about Italian indigenous shamanism now, but about folk witchcraft. So what I noticed during my research is that you still find throughout Italy these forms of vernacular healing practices and folk witchcraft, and they are widespread throughout Italy. So you find them in every region, and every region has their own term for their practitioner. They wouldn't call themselves witches, especially the old generation of folk Italian witches, because the term witch in Italian, and I guess even in English, has a negative connotation and a history of antagonism with the Catholic Church, and Italy is still quite a strong Catholic country. So obviously people wouldn't want to be. I guess that pagans now would use happily the term witch, the Italian equivalent, which is strega. They would happily use the term witch because it's more reclaiming that term. But older generations would kind of avoid to use the term because it's considered to be a derogatory term.
Right.
So what I found is that transregionally, there is a practice that is found across the board, and that is the practice of the segnature. And segnatura singular or segnature plural is a combination of gestures and words. that you would, you know, the practitioner uses on a specific person or for a specific situation to affect change, basically to practice magic. Now these segnature are passed down from generation to generation, and you have different ways of doing so. There are certain staples like Christmas Eve. The night of Christmas Eve is the most common time when the segnature are passed down, and usually it is only one person that they get passed down to, and it is often within the family. Especially in the South, there is this strong sense that the person needs to be part of your bloodline. So the most common thing is the grandmother that passes the segnature to the granddaughter or to the grandson, or the grandfather to the grandson as well. Although it's more, it is still, I'd say that the majority of practitioners are still females, but it also depends, because you have northern regions, for instance, where you have a few male practitioners as well. So especially in the past, you would have that these practices are passed down through bloodline, through you know, kinship relations. But what has happened recently is that, and that's one of the things that I report in my PhD as well, is that you actually find a difference between the old tradition, the old generation of practitioners of segnatori and the new generation of segnatori. And the main difference is how willing are they to share their practices. So the old generation of segnatori are these healers or witches that, you know, are perhaps 50 years old or older, even though I don't think that the you know, the dividing factor is really age related. It often happens that people over a certain age may fall under the category of the old generation, but it's not necessarily the case. The most important thing is how willing are they to share the practice. So quite often people that are also biologically older tend to you know, practice these things in secluded places or on the countryside, in small towns, and they don't want to share at all their practices. And you wouldn't know that they even practice unless you are part of the community or you need help. So if you need help, you have the you know, something that needs to be healed, and there are also specific mythological names for specific diseases. Like for the shingles, you have Saint Anthony's fire. In Italian would be different, Fuoco di Sant'Antonio in Italian. But yeah, you have, so for instance, if you have something like that, they would say, oh, there is this woman in this town, she will help you with that. So they wouldn't have a term, you know, the witch of the town or the healer of the town. They would just say there is this woman or there is this man that helps people with this specific problem. And of course, you don't only have healing, you also have curses, and you have the malocchio and removal of the malocchio. So you have the whole spectrum of things. But what is interesting is that the new generation of segnatori are more willing to share their practices, are more willing to initiate people outside of the bloodline, and are more willing to share initiations, because usually traditionally for the old generation you would only get passed down the one or two powers or abilities that your grandfather or grandmother had. So for instance, if my grandmother had the ability to remove the malocchio, the evil eye, that's the only thing that I would be able to do with the only segnature that would be passed down to me. Whereas now, what is happening with the new generation is that, for instance, if I have that specific segnatura and you have another one to heal, you know, a set of different illnesses, we share the segnatura, so we initiate each other, and then we have 2 or 3 or 4. Wow. And so this is what is happening now with the new generation of segnatori. They are sharing these initiations among themselves and even outside of the bloodline. Although they may have, they often have certain prerequisites. So for instance, you need to have been initiated by a family member, so you need to already be part of, you know, that kind of tradition, and then you can also acquire other abilities, thanks to this new openness that is out there.
And how far back do these traditions go?
That's a good question, and I don't have an answer for it, because I think it would be extremely difficult to trace them back in history, before the 20th century. And of course, I get asked a lot about Ginsburg and Bene Candaria, which for some reason, a lot of people in the US who are interested in Italian witchcraft, they know about Ginsburg's work, but they don't know about Ernesto de Martino, which is more recent. It's not about the 16th or the 17th century in one specific place in Italy. But yeah, you know, if people are interested in Italian witchcraft, well, of course I know why, because Ginsburg has been translated in English, and Ernesto de Martino also has been translated, but he's not as known for some reason, even though among scholars he's very well known. He's like the most important, the most famous, I'd say, anthropologist of the 20th century, the Italian anthropologist in Italy, I mean. Yeah, even of course, you see with De Martino that there are already, these practices were studied in the mid 20th century, like in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s. But it's difficult to trace them back with accuracy. My gut feeling is that they go at least back a few centuries.
Wow.
Even it could be even more than that, but it's just difficult to, you know, you would need to do like a historical study on that. For instance, one thing that fascinates me, and I was watching Justin's video the other day from Esoterica, Dr. Justin Sledge,
Yeah,
a
yeah.
friend of mine, and he made recently a video on Paracelsus.
Yep.
And I was, it's funny because like, oh wow, he read my mind, because I was looking at Paracelsus again. And one thing that interests me about Paracelsus is the doctrine of the signatures, which resembles, you know, it sounds very similar to segnature, especially the way it is spelled. It is spelled basically kind of the same, very similarly.
You're right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and so I'm kind of wondering whether there is some kind of connection there between the doctrine of the signatures and the contemporary segnature.
Wow.
Um,
That's
there,
fascinating.
yeah, so in that case, it could go back even to Paracelsus, but you know, there isn't enough historical grounds to sort of assert anything like that. But it is something that, it is a parallel that fascinates me, and I have to look more into that.
Is there any evidence of there being conflicting houses, like some like rivalry going on, or are these all sort of working together? Are they all friends?
Oh well, human beings, you know,
Right.
you find human patterns of behavior everywhere. I'd say
Very
in
true.
every religion, in every practice. So yeah, you can have rivalry, but you can also have collaboration. It really depends on the person. But one thing, especially for the old generation of these practitioners, you have that every town had its own healer or its own, you know, practitioner, and in that case there might have been some kind of rivalry if there was somebody else that was trying to be, you know, the town healer or the town witch. But now that is not quite the case anymore. But
And I'm wondering if the term Witcher is this like a, you know how they have witch and Witcher? Is this a thing in this category, or are they all just witches?
well, as I said, it's more of a netic term. So in anthropological research we distinguish between amic and etic terms, because amic means how practitioners would define themselves, and ethic labels are how anthropologists or scholars would define the phenomenon they observe. And in some cases, I would say quite often actually, you find that the scholar's perspective, so the perspective of somebody who is studying the phenomenon, will lead to attributing labels in a different way than practitioners would use them for themselves. Because of course, when you are using a label for yourself, there are a lot of things that go into why you would call yourself one term or another. So for instance, if you live in a town that is strongly Catholic, and the idea of being a witch would lead you to being sort of rejected by your community in one way or another, you definitely wouldn't use the term witch. But then a scholar that studies what is witchcraft and observes the phenomenon and doesn't have that kind of personal investment, you are freer in a way to define it as witchcraft if it fits the pattern and definition that other scholars and yourself have found to be what defines witchcraft. So that's why there is sometimes a discrepancy between how practitioners call themselves and how scholars would classify them. So I would say that they are witches. They would get mad at me for saying that. But so I'd say that these can be defined as witches in that they practice magic. And then how we define witchcraft, often it is said that it is connected to a European folk way of entertaining the practice of magic. That is not I haven't found a specific consensus on the term witchcraft per se, but usually it tends to be referred to the practice of magic within a European, often folk magic context.
And is there any history of persecution against these people? Because
Oh yes.
What are some examples of that?
Yeah, so what I have found in my fieldwork is that I once went to this town in the countryside in the Campania region, and I was told by some informants that there was the town healer, and at some point basically all the people in town would go to the healer instead of the doctor. In this case it was a male healer, because earlier I mentioned that you have that the majority of them are females, but for instance in this case you have a male healer. And so most people in the town would go to the healer and not to the doctor, the medical doctor. And so the doctor sued the healer, and so he had to leave the town. So I'm not sure whether that counts as persecution. Maybe it doesn't, because it's not a religious persecution, but you can have instances of that sort. So I think that especially the old generation, that they tend to be very cautious about who they say and what they say, because we live in a cultural paradigm that wouldn't really allow for them to express freely, even when they are trying to help. And because in the large majority of cases they don't take money either, they don't take a compensation for what they do. It is to help the community, which is quite interesting. In some cases they would accept offerings, in other cases they don't even accept offerings. Like there was this practitioner from Sicily. She was quite well known. It was an old lady, and now unfortunately she passed away. But she left, a legacy there in Sicily, and she wouldn't even accept fruit or vegetables. She would just bring them to the nearest church, because she said as the spirit told her that she should just be of service. And it's interesting because there is another thing that I found in my research, that some of these practitioners, even of the old generation, they would talk about having some kind of interaction with the spirit world, and in some cases they would call them a spirit or spirits. In other cases they would call them saints that they interact with. And they would interact with these saints in a similar way as to how pagans now interact with deities, the way that I described earlier.
Interesting.
So
And
yeah, that is quite interesting.
it really is, and it ties it all together, what we're talking about. And so, and what sort of rites or techniques, rituals, whatever you want to call it, what sort of things do they do? Do they make do they make medicines? Do they do chanting? Do they do some sort of procedure? What sort of things do they do for like healing, for example, or anything?
That depends on the region. So you have a few variations across regions. As I said, the common thing that you find is the use of gestures and words. And these gestures and words are passed down during the initiation process. And they cannot be revealed, they cannot be spoken. Otherwise, you will lose the power. So when they utter those words, well, they don't utter them, that's the point. When they pronounce those words, they do it in a way that is internalized. So it's not like I'm speaking now, I'm projecting the words outwards, whereas they would just pronounce them within their mouth in a way that the sound goes inwards instead of outwards, and the person would not understand what those words are. And usually these words are in the local dialect as well, so they are not even in Italian. The new generation is now translating them in Italian so that they can, sort of exchange segnature trans-regionally. But the traditional way is to use the local dialect. So, but then for healing, yes, in some cases you would have the preparation of concoctions, but that is not particularly prevalent. I'd say that the thing that is more prevalent is to, use gestures on a certain part of the body with these specific symbols that are drawn by hand and these specific words. Sometimes they would use oil to draw the symbol, and other times they would use water. And then it depends, like there is an informant who reported a ritual to remove the fear, which sounds very similar to a soul retrieval ritual from a shamanistic practice. And I found it quite interesting because the idea that, the informant reported that when you have a strong fear response to something, now we would say trauma, we would say trauma that leads to PTSD, but that is not the language that they would have used. They would have said, when something happens and you have this strong fear response, there is part of you that goes away, and then you have to remove the fear. So it's sort of like a fear sticks with you, and hides or removes part of you. So you have to get it back. And this is very similar to the concept of soul retrieval that you find in some shamanistic traditions. So the idea that when something traumatic happens to you, there is part of your soul that is lost, and you have to retrieve that part of the soul so that you can be whole again. And that also plays a role in sort of mental health issues and to overcome them. So in that case, for instance, they would use a plant and a napkin. It's really interesting, the way she would use that napkin with folding it in a very specific way, from the throat to the heart and on the arm. So it was very specific, and I found it to be quite interesting, especially for the resemblance with a soul retrieval ritual that you find in shamanistic practices.
Wow. So do you think there's a lot of parallels between those two?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I did argue that this is a form of shamanism. So yes, I would say that, once you don't define shamanism as something that isn't necessarily non-Western and exotic, and you look at shamanism for the traits that it presents, and you try to get a definition that is context sensitive, because otherwise you wouldn't you wouldn't get anywhere when it comes to defining shamanism in any specific way. So that's why I argue that it is a form of shamanism, because it presents quite a few traits that you find in shamanism.
Wow, that's fascinating stuff. I'm trying to think. Is there anything else that we want to touch on in this subject that we didn't go over yet?
What do you think your viewers might find more interesting?
Well, I think they're going to be really blown away by the Italian folk magic stuff, because it really is kind of a how do I describe it? It's sort of I think that people who sort of find their own way and not just follow a sort of prescribed method of divinity, there's something about that people really gravitate towards in this day and age. I don't know what it is. It's more like a freedom to express yourself in the soul and connect to the divine. And there's something about that I think people are looking for in this day and age, rather than, and I'm not saying religion's bad or anything. There are people who prefer religion, but I also think that having these different outlets for spirituality can be rewarding and even beneficial to a lot of people. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I find that there are quite a few Italian Americans that are interested in Italian witchcraft. So,
yeah, definitely. So, anything you got coming up that you want to promote? Any books coming out? I got your link in the description for the video as well.
Well, I will publish the book version of my PhD dissertation that talks about Italian shamanism and Italian folk magic, but it's gonna take some time because it will be an academic publication, and academic publications take some time for the peer review process and everything. So hopefully next year. So it's not something that is upcoming. So I'd say just we can mention my YouTube channel and my TikTok and my other social media.
Oh, that's right. You have a TikTok as well. So subscribe to Angela Symposium. You're not going to regret it. It is a great channel. It's a treasure of knowledge for study of religions and everything we talked about. But the TikTok as well. And if you're on TikTok, what's your name on TikTok?
It's Dr. Angela Puca on TikTok.
There you go. There you go. And so go and find that. And yeah, this has been really fun, like always. We definitely got to do this again soon.
Yes, absolutely.
And like I always say, you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over